Hello everyone, it's Martin aka Anders, and today we'll be jumping into what for some of you is the long-awaited first installment in a short series on macro-strategic frameworks. This is going to be a little bit different than my normal content in that we're not looking for any hard conclusions here. At the end of this video, there isn't going to be any single bullet point or major fact to remember. Instead, what I'm trying to do is give you the frameworks and the systems that I use myself when thinking about the game in hopes that moving forward, you'll be better equipped to critically think about the game yourselves. With that said, let's jump right into it. Before we jump into this first framework, I want to highlight that it is exactly that, the first framework. The way that I think about this game isn't necessarily tethered to any of these macro-strategic frameworks. More so, it is a marriage of all of them combined and amalgamated into a more comprehensive overview of the game itself. That said, this first one is what for many people would be the most obvious one to jump into, and that's the classification system that Riot themselves use to touch on each of their different agent types. Many people are going to be quite familiar at this point with the Duelist, Controller, Initiator, Sentinel quartet that Riot uses to classify all of the different agents in the game. That said, when thinking about the game from a macro-oriented perspective, this framework can be expanded pretty extensively and elaborated upon so that each of these different roles means far more explicit things than the average person would assume. For example, I'm sure most, if not all players, could list me a Duelist. Or all duelists for that matter. But could they then go the additional step of telling me why that agent is a duelist? And more importantly to this video, what those characteristics then mean in a broader macro-strategic context when building compositions. To set some groundwork, obviously I have in front of us here what I see as the benchmark ability types that will generally fall under each of these classifications. These are by no means hard and fast rules that don't have gray areas or exceptions, but for the overwhelming majority of cases, this rings true across all of the classes. For instance, duelists will always have entry facilitation and or self-enabling abilities, controllers will always have line of sight denial and or ground denial, initiators will always have anti-entrenchment tools as well as support abilities, and sentinels will generally have flank denial and or stall. At this point though, those are still pretty abstract in concept, and so you can even go a further step, turning them into incredibly concrete and easily equatable ability silos in order to identify different agent characteristics. For instance, you may be asking yourself, okay, what is entry facilitation in terms of actual tangible agent abilities? And I've encapsulated that personally down to one of two major categories: self-capitalizing flashes, meaning flashes where you pull your gun out quickly enough after throwing them that you can actually swing it yourself, and movement abilities, generally more explosive ones than passive ones. It's fairly easy to go down the list from there. You have self-enable, which is relatively straightforward with self-healing and self-buffs, line of sight denial, which is smokes and barriers, probably the most self-explanatory of the list, and then once you get below that to ground denial, things start getting a little bit more sticky and convoluted. Ground denial in the controller context is specifically zonal damage over time. This is important because when we go this next step down to anti-entrenchment tools that initiators have, we have pop damage. There's a very distinct difference between putting something like a Molotov on the ground and saying, alright, you can't have this space for the next 5 to 8 seconds, versus, alright, I'm gonna shoot my breach aftershock into this position, and if you stand there for the next 3 seconds, you're going to instantly die. Beyond just that pop damage, you have other anti-entrenchment initiator tools like entry by proxy. We're talking about things like Trailblazer from Sky and Aldrum from Sova in this context. Team-oriented flashes, we're looking specifically at things like Sky's blinding lights and Breach's flashpoints, and active information gathering, things like Sova's recon darts. The peg below that is sort of the inverse of Duelist's self-enable in that it is support, it is externally focused healing and externally focused buffs. And then we get down to Sentinels, who specialize in flank denial via passive information and traps, and stall via movement inhibitors and concussions. With this framework, you can go through effectively every agent in the game, and they will fall categorically in exactly as you want them. Just as a little proof of concept, we can take a look at a couple different agents and expand on this a little bit further, because I don't think that this is a case where you only have Agent X that is a duelist and Agent Y that is a sentinel. In my personal use case for this framework, you always have a primary type for an agent as well as a secondary type. For instance, if we take a look at Jet, obviously we all know that she's a duelist. She has a very clear entry facilitation tool in her dashes, and that's sort of the primary shtick of her kit. The one part of her kit that isn't an explicit duelist tool is actually her Cloudburst, which brings her a little bit into the controller silo, providing her with light line of sight denial. This was even more so the case prior to the recent nerfs, when she had 7-second smokes. It is quite clear from a design perspective and from an inherent ability type perspective that Jet is a primary type duelist with a controller subtype. Let's move on to a little bit of a more tricky one with Breach. Clearly his primary type is as an initiator. Almost his entire kit is anti-entrenchment tools. He has team-oriented flashes, he has pop damage, and he has in his ultimate Rolling Thunder what is one of the very few examples of an offensively oriented concussion. Moving down to his subtype though, we end up categorizing him as a sentinel because of the very clear pool of stall capabilities that he brings to the table. Both Faultline and Rolling Thunder offer the unique dual purpose that they can be used to deny pockets of space and force people off of angles as anti-entrenchment tools, but they can also be used as extremely effective stall utility. This characteristic was put on grand display earlier in the game's development in beta, when Breach was used as a soft sentinel on A site on bind very frequently, holding down U-Haul and using a counter-timed fault line down A short for stall. Moving on to our second to last example, we have Cypher, who, sort of like Jet, is one of the more cut and dry examples that exists. His primary type of sentinel is about as obvious as it gets. Moving on to his secondary type, he is very clearly a controller due to cyber cages. While cyber cages can definitely be used in a very sentinel way, and that's probably the most intuitive way of using them, something like you'd see on Bind B, where you have cyber cages on either side of tube and you're using them as a way to more effectively anchor the site, but there's also corner cases like we see out of Andbox when they play Split, where they're using cyber cages as a way to take aggressive space in A main and using them to prime their exec positioning. That is far more of a controller utilization of this tool than you would ever generally expect from a Sentinel. And that brings us to the last example we're going to look at here in terms of individual agents with Omen. Omen is, of course, a controller primary type, although in far grayer a space than many of the other agents on this list. Dark Cover is very clearly a potent line of sight denial tool, and it is the core most ability of Omen's kit, but when we start to dive into the rest of his kit, he's actually less controller than he is other categories. This state of being is something I've elaborated a little bit on in the past, and it's that in most contexts, I actually see Omen as more of a primary type initiator, secondary type controller than I do as a primary type controller. You look at his kit and he has Paranoia, one of the strongest initiation tools in the game as a team-focused flash. You have an ultimate that provides very effective active information gathering, another anti-entrenchment tool. And you have Shrouded Step, which on its face is technically an entry facilitation tool in that it is a movement ability, but due to the fact that it is a long channel time, more of a passive movement ability than it is anything else, I see it more as a tool that is meant to be combined with Dark Covers as a soft initiation tool, and that puts Omen in a very precarious place in terms of how to classify him. Funnily enough, I think it's this difficulty of classification that in some ways is a major flag as to why Omen has such a large meta prevalence as he does. He more effectively straddles an interclass line than almost any other agent in the game. Now that we've taken a look at the overarching classification framework on an agent-by-agent basis, let's dive in a little bit at what it looks like when tackling entire compositions. Starting here, we have what is a fairly normal iteration of North American Standard. If we break out each of these agents in terms of both their primary and secondary type classifications, you have a Sentinel controller in Cypher, a Duelist controller in Jet, a controller initiator in Omen, an initiator Sentinel in Sova, and in Phoenix's case, a bit of an oddball in that he is a Duelist primary and a controller Duelist secondary. The reason I'm comfortable putting Phoenix in this weird split secondary position is because in my eyes, he is an agent that truly has split abilities. There are two distinct modes for something like Blaze Wall, which can in one case be used as an LOS obstruction tool, and in another case be used as a pure Duelist utility for self-healing. In functionally all other cases where agents have a dual or multi-purpose ability, it's not as distinctly binary. It's an ability that can be used one way or this way or somewhere vaguely in between. It's more along a sliding scale, where in Phoenix's case, you're more often than not going to see the Phoenix using his Blaze Wall specifically for its controllery purpose, or expressly as a healing tool somewhere in a corner. But I digress. The reason I bring this up is because when you boil all of that down to a quantifiable listing, you have two primary type duelists, one primary type controller, one primary type initiator, and one primary type sentinel. And what is the most intriguing part for me personally, you get a mix of secondary types. In this case with half a duelist secondary, 2.5 controller secondaries, one initiator secondary, and one sentinel secondary. It's when you start looking at the composition in this broader, holistic context that you can start making assumptions and calculations around the stylistic bias that this composition has, what sort of tools they're very likely to lean into, and ultimately you can use this to map your expectations on how that team will likely try to play the game. In this case in particular, you could say they're running double duelist and only a single primary and secondary type initiator. This tells me that they're fairly light on catalytic tools to start off executes. You're looking at their Aldrone, you're looking at their Paranoia, and you're looking at dedicating the entries themselves, the duelists, to starting the execute. This means that the propensity for this composition to use that Paranoia or use that Aldrone on the side of the map that they don't intend on ending is fairly improbable because they just don't have the spare pieces of utility to take redundant space. Continuing on a similar train of thought, there's 2.5 subtype controllers in this comp. They have a glut of line of sight denial tools. What that tells me is that they're far more likely to be taking redundant space, if they do at all, via the use of soft LOS denial tools as opposed to those high estimated value initiation tools that they'll likely be holding for their final executes. Obviously, these aren't hardline rules, but what they are the steady state assumptions that you can make about this comp based off of the resources it has available. In my eyes, this is in many ways the next evolution of one of the more traditional tactical processes in Counter-Strike of counting flashes and counting smokes. We are now counting archetypes and assessing the tools that those archetypes have in order to better assess the presumed playstyle that our opponents are going to utilize. Looking at the other side of that coin, we're pivoting over to what is more of a European standard composition. A lot of people will look at this composition versus the last and say, okay, they're overwhelmingly similar, the only difference is that they chose a different flasher. I think that the layers of difference between this and the last composition are far more extreme. This isn't a simple case of a flash for a flash. One of the ways you can think about this is that, at least in theory, every agent in the game is balanced. There is a specific amount of quote-unquote balance points representing the agent's power level that is even across all agents but is allocated differently for each agent's kit. In Phoenix's case, a non-negligible amount of his balance points are allocated to self-sufficiency tools, his self-healing, and otherwise largely selfish abilities. In Breach's case, those points are instead allocated to a much more team-oriented collection of skills. Additionally, one of the side effects of that is that the team-oriented skills generally come in higher volume than the selfish ones. And so this comp ultimately boils down to one primary duelist, one primary controller, two primary initiators, and one primary sentinel, with 0 secondary duelists, 2 secondary controllers, 1 secondary initiator, and 2 secondary sentinels. If we use the same deductive reasoning process that we used on the last, it's almost an entirely different story than the previous. Where in the last we were looking at stronger than average entry power but a shortage of initiation tools, here we see a gross surplus of initiation tools. What this will translate to is that where in the last comp they had to be very selective with the space that they were taking because they didn't have a lot of tools to fall back on if that space was redundant or unneeded for their ultimate game plan, this comp has so many high potency and easy to follow up initiation tools that they can take redundant space on a fairly frequent basis and still have more than enough to get themselves onto site when the exec finally comes. This lends itself incredibly well to dynamic defaulting, which makes a ton of sense when you start to look at EU's overall playstyle. They lean very heavily into defaulting and in some cases are taking space, yielding it, and then retaking that same pocket of space later in a round. If we look at the composition that we saw before this, it would struggle immensely if it were to take that approach to a game. It's either going to be using utility to take that space both times and have slim to nothing left in the tank when they get to executing, or it's going to have to rely on its duelists taking dry fights to take that space during one or both of the instances prior to the exec. So while in its most shallow form, this is a change where it is merely a flash for a flash, you are looking at a full-blown macro-strategic shift in the way that these two compositions want to be played. One will lean very clearly into explosivity, choosing a site, hitting it, using the utility that they have to high effect, whereas this one instead chooses high volumes of utility so that it can play the map more dynamically and play the clock, play for information before it decides to close. And while we've now used this approach to analyze two specific compositions, you can also use it on a far broader scale. If I use this approach to quantify every composition that we've seen to date in competitive Valorant and stratify it to the most recent 2 patches, we can see what the most common archetypal buildup is, as well as what the average archetypal buildup is. Starting with the median, we see that it's fairly similar to what North American Standard was, with double duelist primaries, a single controller primary, a single initiator, and a single sentinel primary, no duelist subtypes, 2 controller subtypes, 2 initiator subtypes, and 1 sentinel subtype. While this in and of itself is just a cool, more abstract way of looking at the meta than we generally have, it also gives us access to the same process that we used in the previous compositions, where we can dive down and intuitively suss out what playstyle inclination the most commonly played composition has on a global basis. That playstyle being a leaning into double duelist and a soft bias for supplemental utility in both the controller and initiator verticals. Moving over to the average, you get a little bit of a better idea of the diversity of composition that we see overall. Very clearly this does align fairly closely with what we were just looking at, but you can see with the uptick in initiator primaries, as well as the soft downtick in primary sentinels, that the prevailing approach is really leaning more into an aggressive, initiator-heavy, mid-rangey configuration than it is into sort of a deep map control entrenchment style. That doesn't necessarily mean that you should follow suit and play that style. In fact, many would argue that, if anything, you should be figuring out how to beat that and diverging from the most common approach. The idea here is that this framework allows you to at least have that information from the get-go. Alright, and that will wrap us up for this first installment in the framework series. Again, this was sort of the most intuitive, most obvious one to tackle first, seeing as Riot gave it to us themselves. It's very clearly meant to be applied to Valorant, and so hopefully is a great building block moving into the rest of this series. From here, we'll probably be getting quite a bit more abstract as I draw more and more from my personal experience as opposed to something that is explicitly for this game. We're going to tackle things like how to bring competitive TCG strategy across, and how to transmute learnings from tabletop wargames and RTSs into TAC FPS. Hopefully things that you guys will find super interesting and bring a little bit of diversity to the way that people are viewing this game, at least when it comes to compositional theory and macro strategy. Would love to hear down in the comments below what you guys thought of this video, and if there's anything in particular in terms of frameworks that you yourself use when looking at this game. Hopefully you'll stick around for the future episodes, and if you didn't see, I actually just announced on my Twitter that there's also a bunch of other content coming down the pipeline that hopefully you all will stick around for. I'll be launching 3 major series on this channel. Set Play, where I'll be tackling sort of highlight rounds from recent tournaments. The Retake, which will be a home for my hot takes and most opinionated stuff that I can put out, as well as Computing Competitive, which some of you may remember is where I tackle the statistics of highlight events from around the world. Per the usual, really appreciate you guys tuning in. Don't forget to like and subscribe. You can also find me on Twitter, Twitch, and Instagram, all at AnderzzTV. I've been getting into co-streaming quite a bit, and in fact, as soon as I'm done recording this video, I'll be hopping on to co-stream some North American VCT playoffs. And so, as always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.